So you might think I would begin this sermon by talking about Wicked, but I'm not. When he was preparing to die, or so the story goes, the revered Rabbi Zusia had a vision. Lying there on his deathbed, he awakened in the night, crying and afraid. His devoted students were already gathered round him at his bedside, and they leaned in to comfort their revered, beloved Rebbe. Rabbi, they pleaded, why are you crying? You who have been so humble, you have been so wise, you who have been as true to God as Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moses. Why are you crying? And Zusia replied, my dear ones, I have awakened afraid because I have had a horrible vision. I have realized that in the world to come, after I die and I meet God, God will not ask me why I was not more like Moses. When I die, God will ask me why I wasn't more like Zusia, why I wasn't more like me. Every human being has the capacity to bring their individual, authentic expression of divinity to life in this world. Each one of us is full of unique gifts and challenges, strengths and growing edges, and the ability to show up with mercy, with goodness, with compassion, with kindred, loving, thoughtful connection. And we don't all need to be like Moshe, and that would be pretty boring, right? Horribly boring. And while many are wearing pink or green today, none of us here needs to be like Elphaba or Glinda either. The pure soul question for each one of us is, how do we live into actualization of our own unique, blessed, authentic human selves? And then maybe the next question would be, how do we celebrate others joyfully who journey with us along the way? So yesterday, I'm going to tell you about yesterday. I had the joy of leading the UU Community Church's board in a half-day retreat. We just spent a few hours together, and yet it was ripe with meaning and connection. And if you tiptoe or roll on downstairs during coffee hour or the pledge party, you'll see some of the remnants of our retreat on the wall. There are a lot of little cards where we named our assets, the assets, all the resources, all of the incredible resources available to us here in this community. And some of them were physical, including like this sanctuary and the pews that you are sitting on right now, but we also listed the personal talents and interests and things that each individual values and brings when they show up here in community. So these we named as our precious and renewable resources. Things were named like the ability to paint or solder or make music or listen with compassion. Gifts like these only grow when we share them. They don't run out. When we practice what we share, this paves pathways in our minds and our hearts, and these things actually grow. They become our superpowers. So let me share a little more with you about what I mean when I say renewable resources. One thing that was discussed was the appreciation for music and the choir, which I'm appreciating so much today, and I know you are. So when we sing, we don't run out of the ability to sing after sharing a song, right? What happens? When we practice, when we rehearse, when we sing in community here at church or in the streets at marches, our voices grow stronger. We learn to listen to one another. When we sing, we feel the rhythm in our bodies. We connect with melody and meaning, and the more that we do it, the more our music-making capacity grows. Love is also like this. When we practice loving, we grow the capacity of our hearts. The heart is a muscle, and perhaps the spirit is too. And church, maybe it's our gym, where our hearts get a workout, or maybe it's our dance floor where we joyfully and jubilantly, jubilance was something that was named as an asset of this congregation, practice the art of being our unique selves. Maybe church is a place to let our unique gifts and beautiful lights shine. So, what does this have to do with Wicked? A little background. So I first became aware of Wicked the musical while routinely commuting between Berkeley and San Francisco for work around 2009 or 10. The Broadway version of Wicked actually began in San Francisco. Many of you probably know that, in 2003. And I can still remember the posters on the wall in the BART station, the compelling green witch grinning under that brim of her black hat, the intriguing title that I knew referenced a revisionist history of the Wizard of Oz. The known plot twist of the Wicked storyline was that it was subversively questioned within the tale who was really wicked, while telling the backstory, the history of the Wizard of Oz. So Wicked the musical has now aged more than 2 decades. It hit the big screen in movie theaters last fall, so it's kind of been revived. However, the original story is over 100 years old, told in the 1900 publication of The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum, 1900. Wizard of Oz, the movie, which many of us are more familiar with than L. Frank Baum's books, was released in Technicolor nearly 40 years later in 1939. It tells the story of Dorothy Gale of Kansas, who after landing in Oz during a twister, seeks the wizard's assistance to get back home. With the help of her companions, Dorothy successfully battles the Wicked Witch of the West and comes to realize that the power for her to return home never resided outside of her. It was never with the wizard. It was actually inside her all along. So you see that commonality there if you're thinking about Wicked, the power that resided in her all along. So it might surprise you, as it surprised me. My daughter's actually reading all of L. Frank Baum's books right now, to know that the Wicked Witch of the West is actually a pretty minor character in L. Frank Baum's original novels. And not only that, she's not green. The witch's green skin was added as an element to the Wizard of Oz because it was shown in Technicolor to create a vivid way to highlight the witch as a villain on the big screen. Isn't it interesting how stories can change, how things that may not have ever been true can be added, and how stories and the great mythos of our consciousness can change and evolve over time. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. It's just interesting to note. So the novelist Gregory Maguire expands the element of the witch's green skin tremendously. He's actually riffing more off the movie than the original books. In his book, Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, published many years later in 1995. The title of Maguire's novel is an overt reference to the propaganda element surrounding the wicked green-skinned witch. His story explores themes of truth, friendship, and solidarity amidst a culture of scapegoating and slander during the rise of a fascist regime in Oz. Who is really wicked? His story asks. What is true wickedness? So Maguire's Wicked novel was written during the Gulf War of the late 90s and is as politically relevant today as it was then. It was still relevant when it was released as a Broadway musical during the Bush administration in the aftermath of 9/11. And now, as the movie enters our consciousness during the return of the Trump administration, it has felt particularly current as our country has braced itself against the revival of a conservative regime that threatens a fascist overhaul of our national government. The themes of Wicked have caused many to reflect upon the onslaught of propaganda and fascist elements in our Western culture. So for those of you who aren't so familiar and thought that it was just about glitter and magic wands and a big bubble and a fairy floating in the sky or a green-skinned witch belting out tunes from her broomstick, it's got more depth than that. Though for those of us who love musical theater, it definitely does have that pizzazz element as well. It's definitely something to see if you haven't. So some background about Wicked for those of you who don't know the story, and I know some of you, many of you already know it, and maybe if you don't, you're not really interested if you haven't figured it out or been attracted to learning about it yet. But given that the Broadway musical has been pulsing in the zeitgeist for more than 20 years, I assume that at this point some of you know the details more or less, their common cultural knowledge, and given the title of the sermon, you knew you might be subject to a few spoilers. So leave now if you're not interested in those. The story of Wicked is about a green-skinned girl, Elphaba. Elphaba's personal struggle includes being ostracized and bullied for the green color of her skin, and she also struggles with not being able to control her inner power, this magic that she's really unfamiliar with how to manage. She quickly becomes a beloved character for those of us who are watching the movie. She is the movie's ultimate hero, and as onlookers, we root for her to overcome her external obstacles while she learns to harness her internal strength, which includes even more than her gift of magic, her incredible capacity for empathy, which drives her instinct to speak truth to power. Elphaba, who later becomes the Wicked Witch of the West, meets Galinda, who is destined to become the Good Witch of the North, at a boarding school called Shiz. The story of Wicked revolves around these two main characters, primarily Elphaba and Glinda, green and pink. Elphaba and her personal struggle of being marginalized for her skin color runs alongside in complexity with the character of Glinda, who harnesses the social power of privilege and who uses a perfectly polished appearance to become popular. Within the story are multiple forms of superficial falseness, sometimes taking the form of fake news, including the scapegoating of a marginalized group that becomes targeted, which shows how propaganda can be used to brainwash the masses into believing what's good and what's not good, as well as how power and privilege weave and dance among us to inform, promote, and uphold the larger messages that we're surrounded by, and sometimes that we begin to tell ourselves. The fascist elements of Wicked present themselves through the villains of the story, primarily the Wizard of Oz and Madame Morrible, headmistress of Shiz. The strategy of their campaign is to scapegoat and oppress a certain group through propaganda in order to promote themselves and elevate their own power. This tack is revealed in these words from the wizard, quote, the best way to bring folks together is to give them a really good enemy. When Elphaba defies their lies and chooses the truth fueled by her love for those who are oppressed, the wizard and the headmistress turn against her, and she also becomes their target. Finding unity through a common enemy is not a new tactic in human society. And while the creation of a faux enemy in the wicked story is unjust, the key to understanding the power in the story is to actually look beyond the superficial conflict of the characters that are truly wicked. Now, I know the title is Wicked, and that is the crux and thrust of the story, and it is important. However, the true power of the story is not only in uncovering who is truly wicked. It's definitely a part of it, and it's an important part of our society today to be like Elphaba, honestly. Boldly naming the truth when our government is actively oppressing the most marginalized among us. There are many here in this room who ourselves are fighting for justice, and it's incredibly important that we not remain silent. I hope you felt my passion in that. I feel pretty strongly. And I think it's okay to be angry about it too. The true hero of today's story will say out loud if the emperor has no clothes. Am I right? Yeah. However, let us not fall into the trap of believing that we too are made stronger or are brought together by having a really good enemy. That does not unify us. We are not bound together by what we hate or by what hates. That does not create community. We are made stronger by remaining true to what we love. After seeing the Wicked movie last November, I happened upon Brené Brown's book. I brought it with me in my suitcase. Bill knows I packed too much. He picked me up at the airport. It's a great book. Brené Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart, Mapping Meaningful Connection in the Language of Human Experience. This book is a reference guide to Brown's research on human emotions, a dictionary of the human experience, if you will. And I opened it to the page on Schadenfreude, the German word that literally means taking pleasure or joy in another person's suffering, delighting in someone else's misfortune. We've all experienced a little Schadenfreude. Brown's research reveals the weakness of Schadenfreude is that while celebrating the demise of another person or a group might bring a momentary rush or a sense of connection, I'm thinking about the beginning of the movie, right? When the witch is burned in effigy, delighting in another person's misfortune. It shows that this might bring a momentary rush, but it never creates community. It never creates community. The line from Wicked, the best way to bring folks together is to give them a really good enemy, it's not true. It doesn't work like that. Schadenfreude is an emotion, quote, born out of fear, powerlessness, and sometimes from a sense of deservedness or unearned privilege. It's a form of counter-empathy, meaning it dials down our empathy, our ability to feel compassion by othering or distancing ourselves from another individual or group. Now, Brown says it's important to point out, especially in today's political and social climate, that when we feel relieved or grateful or even happy that someone who has done something hurtful, unethical, or unjust is held accountable, that's not Schadenfreude, and normally doesn't stem from counter-empathy. On the contrary, she says, it can stem from empathy for the aggrieved. So let's just be clear. But this leads me to my point. What does Wicked have to teach us about love and fascism? Elphaba is an incredible heroine or hero in the story, and as we will hear in the choir's closing song, her ability to boldly speak truth to power is the catalyst for her harnessing the ability to defy gravity, to not get bogged down, to learn to fly. However, Elphaba is not driven to revolt against the wizard's wicked ways because she possesses some sort of superpower of defiance. She does assert defiance, but that's not the point. Elphaba's superpower is her empathy. Elphaba grew up as an outcast, so she never had the opportunity to learn to dress or act performatively in order to be popular or accepted by the status quo. And in so doing, she was also given the gift of authenticity. She could only be herself. She was only ever asked to be truly herself and connected to the truth in her own heart. That groove, she got to practice that over and over and over again, and it drove her to remain committed to naming the truth and protecting what she loved. Elphaba knew the pain of being scapegoated and ostracized, and so she was brave enough to take a risk and defy the most powerful person in the land in order to remain true to herself and true to her core values. Real community is not formed by being driven to oppose who or what we hate. In fact, the best way to bring folks together is to unite them around what we love. And this is what we do here. This is what we do as Unitarian Universalists. It's just helpful that we have love at the center of our UU values. If it wasn't there in our values, it would be there anyway, right? We named what was true about ourselves when we wrote those. It is love that drives Just Act to post on groups.io about how to support immigrants during these precarious times. It is love that encourages the Queer Affinity group to reserve a table at the Pride Fest. It is love that drives us to rally and support the rights of others and to protect the most vulnerable among us. It is love that calls us to do what we can to turn the tides of climate change and care for our earthly home. We do not do these things because of hate or because we oppose anyone. We do them because of love. We may need to oppose in order to love better or more fully. But you get my point. So while we may share some common enemies, the real thing that unites us isn't what we are against. We are united by what we are for. So I ask you, UU Community Church of Washington County, what are we for? Love. Nice. What else?
Anti-fascism. Justice.
Come on.
Empathy. Truth. Community. Kindness.
Kindness, empathy, truth, music, compassion. Anti-fascism is okay too. Acceptance. Integrity. Honesty. Soup Sunday. Food. Appreciation.
Appreciation
Of beauty. Embrace.
Gophers.
Gophers! We haven't shut them out yet. Inclusivity. Please go on downstairs and gather around, and maybe Christine will give you a few more note cards and you can write more things and add them to the wall of the things that we love and appreciate. So I started this sermon with the story of Zusia. Remember Zusia, who was on his deathbed and who mourned that he wished that in his life he had been more fully, more authentically, more unabashedly Zusia? The medicine of this story is that God, or the universe, or the spirit of love, or the spirit of life wants us to be joyfully ourselves and wants us to protect and uplift everyone around us. That is our calling. The point of this is that we get to be this with each other and share who we are and enjoy each other in community. So who and what are we for? What unifies us in love? Let us continue to ask ourselves these questions as we rise in body or in spirit and join in singing our closing hymn, We Shall Be Known by Ma Muse. You have the lyrics in your order of service or in the chat.